You cannot regulate an abomination, you have got to stop it. That is from Wendell Berry. In climate crisis deliberation, too much attention is on institutional band-aids, technological fixes, and consumer distraction. In order to confront overconsumptive industrial waste convenience culture, we must persistently frame our questions and actions within the context of greenwashing. Eco-capitalist strategies that sustain environmental racism through green colonialism. By scrutinizing the interrelational roots of our geopolitical, ecological, health, and social crises, we can transform theory into citizen activism. This lived consciousness demonstrates embodied energy. Embodied energy designates local and global relationships of production, consumption, and disposal. Rather than asking, how can we save industrial civilization, disentangling green colonialism, greenwashing, and environmental racism in the Renewable Revolution, my presentation today, explores how can we mobilize urgent collaborative action that does not reproduce the very interconnected subjugations we are attempting to overcome. The we and our to which I refer is addressed to those who actively participate in dominator civilizations, characterized by middle-class standard of living that depends upon toxic systems and the exploited labor of others. This inquiry is founded on how can we live our lives without sacrificing the lives of others? How can we transition from our petroleum, pharmaceutical-addicted cyberculture to an economics of solidarity rooted in symbiotic solutions? How can we decolonize our thinking as we learn from cross-cultural models of mutual accountability, cultural biomimicry, and ancient traditions, ancestral teachings that guide us to establish eco-regenerative infrastructures? Vandana Shiva reminds us that the concept of resources is rooted in the rhetoric of imperialist-driven anthropocentric progress. Racial capitalism converts living communities into dead commodities, and dead commodities into private wealth. We measure success, equality, within the paradigm of white supremacist, taken-for-granted, growth-driven consumerism, ultimately hyperconformism. In the name of progress, we justify the xenophobic and ecocidal construct of resource. Similarly, Linda Hogan warns us, quote, decent people commit horrible crimes that are acceptable because of progress, end quote. In her Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, Hannah Arendt unravels the systemic violence of the everyday as society's normalizing otherwise immoral behavior. Such habituated obedience manifests through reformist, technocratic solutions, such as the corporate green economy, carbon offsetting, emissions trading, climate-smart agriculture, geoengineering, and the erroneously named Renewable Energy Revolution. This manifestation of neocolonialism depends on the externalization of costs that reinforce sacrifice zones. Mainstream standard of living that is maintained at the expense of other people and of wildlife. As with climate crisis injustices, those least responsible for converging calamities are the hardest hit. Reduced to collateral damage, disproportionately impacted human communities and natural world habitat destruction are implicit in mass production and disposal of most industrial-scale alternative energies. Solar, wind, biomass, biofuels, agrofuels, hydrotechnologies, geothermal, ethanol, hydrogen, nuclear, and other ostensible renewables. Furthermore, many of these energies are low power density. They produce very little energy in proportion to the embodied energies required to institutionalize them. Unless we rigorously interrogate the racist infrastructures implicit in these sustainable solutions, we perpetuate the assault of convenience culture. For example, rarely considered are the fossil fuel sources used to supply the electricity for private and public electric vehicles. Too frequently, the poorest populations work and live near coal mines, power plants, and fracking stations. It is imperative that we challenge the roots and implications of how perceived solutions to our climate crisis may unintentionally escalate ecological devastation and global wealth inequities, and actually divert us from establishing long-term, empowering infrastructures. We must critically question our transition from global petroculture, not necessarily based on the motivation, but on the underlying faulty assumptions and strategies that perceived sustainability agendas offer. Alternative forms of energy proposed to power our public electrical grids are misidentified under misleading misnomers, labels such as renewable, emission-free, carbon-free, sustainable, safe, green, clean. Václav Smil warns us of this miasma of falsehood. The green economy has come to mean the wholesale privatization of nature. Through dependency on what is deceptively identified as renewable energies, the greening of capitalism materializes as green colonialism. We must be attentive to the ways in which we unconsciously manifest the very racist hegemonies we seek to dislodge. Among other corporate giants, corporatized education, big tech, big pharma, and agribusiness payoffs drive policy. Even if policy appears to be in alignment with environmental ethics, we are consistently finding that policy change simply replaces one hegemony with another. Echoing the greenwashing agenda underlying the Green New Deal, one perceived solution is President Biden's American Jobs Plan. In his book, The Disinformation Age, Eric Chaffetz alerts us the Green New Deal is, quote, a capitalist solution to a capitalist problem, end quote. It claims to address the linked oppressions, yet its proposed solution avoid the very roots of each crisis. Congruently, we must examine the insidious manifestations of greenwashing and environmental racism in the context of what I call humanitarian imperialism, the ways in which our standard of living dictates and breeds relentless consumption in the name of equality. Environmental refugees are at the center of this vortex of green economy fallacies. Transnational corporations, not governments, control the flow of economies and people. Due to agribusiness tyrannies throughout the global south, for the first time in history, more people live in cities than in rural environments. 80% of these city dwellers live in slums. Suicide is an alternative to forced migration. 200,000 farmers in India have committed suicide in the past decade, many by drinking the very pesticide they could no longer use on their crops. The term environmental refugee is a demarcation for how climate chaos generates floods of refugees. Over 330 million environmental refugees, landless, homeless, stateless, are without food or country. The Climate Institute defines environmental refugees as those who flee from droughts, rising sea levels, deforestation, desertification, floods, and other corporate-induced disasters as an ever-increasing global norm. The state of emergency for those who are suffering most directly and immediately is now commonplace. Lester Brown first used the term environmental refugee in 1976. Since then, the categories environmental migrant, forced environmental migrant, environmentally motivated migrant, climate refugee, climate change refugee, environmentally displaced person, an EDP, disaster refugee, environmental displacee, eco-refugee, an ecologically displaced person, an environmental refugee to be, an ERTB, have been absorbed into our language. Greenwashing is one manifestation of corporate atonement, a kind of eco-friendly reparation. Green business maintains some of its most perfidious economic practices today. Consumerism becomes the default for making supposedly ethical choices. For example, numerous green companies that manufacture obviously unhealthy products like Nabisco's Oreos claim to be certified vegan, yet they too are responsible for ecological and cultural carnage. Overt, ethically questionable corporations like Cargill, Nestle, or Monsanto are not the only offenders. Many health-conscious, sustainable production companies, those are all in quotes, are also culpable. Earth Balance makes a popular plant-based butter spread, claiming sustainability is its #1 production standard. It also claims that its products are, quote, animal-free, yet Earth Balance's primary ingredient is palm oil. Palm oil plantations are the leading cause of deforestation. The $44 billion palm oil industry maintains gruesome practices. Thousands of people are displaced, hundreds are abused as slave laborers, and wildlife such as orangutans are clubbed to death by plantation workers, while others are buried alive during massive clear-cutting that also burns elephants and vast tracts of rainforest. Deforestation and mechanized agriculture account for almost a quarter of global emissions of greenhouse gases, the most significant climate emergency culprit. The burning of Brazil and Indonesian forests can be seen from outer space. Since palm oil is now getting bad press among concerned consumers, euphemisms abound. Even though Earth Balance states that its products are part of an, quote, environmentally friendly food chain, it proves to be yet another greenwashing company using sustainable and healthy as manipulative marketing tools. And in my book that I mentioned just a little bit, Zazu Dreams, book on the Anthropocene, I give numerous examples of these greenwashing corporations. In Deep Green Resistance, Lierre Keith reminds us, we can't consume our way out of environmental collapse. Consumption is the problem, end quote. Consumers are capitalism. Without ubiquitous consumer demand, the machine of the profit-driven free market would have to shift gears. We can't blame oil companies without simultaneously implicating ourselves, holding our consumption disposal habits equally responsible. Rather than a call for solipsism, this individual-collective dynamic must be accompanied by policy change and juridical enforcement. This is not simply a dichotomy between giant fossil fuel interests and innocent petroculture-saturated consumers. Binaries dissolve when we reflect on our implicit self-destructive complicity, when we recognize how we are them, and again the we referring to dominator cultures. How can we insist government and transnational corporations be accountable when we refuse to curb our purchase, use, and disposal habits? When we choose to hold only corporations accountable and depend on policy change as the singular solution to our malfeasant modern economy, we bypass underlying roots of climate chaos. Transnational neocolonialism maintains its efficacy because we see ourselves as disempowered individuals, disconnected from the larger context. Manufactured consent through the construction of desire is central to this social engineering narrative. Compliance is implicit in our technocratic race into a sanitized, hyper-electrified 5G future. In The Truman Show, the billionaire televisionary exhorts, quote, we accept the reality of the world we are presented, end quote. Every institution ranging from compulsory education to industrial technology, transportation, entertainment, housing, healthcare, how we raise our children, eat, excrete, bathe, etc., all of it breeds habituated obedience. As technology is assimilated into the structures of the everyday, its ubiquity becomes invisible and necessary. However well-intentioned, supposed alternatives perpetuate hegemonic violence of wasteful behavior and suicidal infrastructures through green colonialism. Even if temporarily abated, they ultimately conserve the original crisis. This includes our petroleum pharmaceutical addictions that rely on technology to create equality. Within corporate-led consumerism and techno-euphoria, collusion includes compulsory Eurocentric model education, the entrapments of consumer-obsessive convenience culture, and privatization of every corporeal and planetary so-called resource, reducing the commons to commodities. Foucault warns us, quote, not only of historical fascism, the fascism of Hitler and Mussolini, but also the fascism in all of us, in our heads and in our everyday behavior, the fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates and exploits us. End quote. Foucault's internalized fascism echoes the sanctity of normalcy that drives habituated obedience. In order to engage root cause analysis, we must question homogeneity masquerading as morality. Greenwashing is a prime example of the ways in which our controlocracy dictates our alleged freedom. Only when we acknowledge the roots of our Western imperialist crises, can we begin to decolonize and revitalize all people's livelihoods and their environments. Zazu dreams Between the Scarab and the Dung Beetle, a cautionary fable for the Anthropocene era, my cross-cultural climate justice book, challenges cultural habits deeply embedded in our calamitous trajectory toward global ecological, cultural, and ethnic collapse. The book's main character, a biracial 10-year-old, warns, what if renewable energies become big business and just maintain our addiction to consumption? Replacing tar sands, oil drills, or coal power plants with megalithic green energy is not the solution. It just masks the original problem, confusing freedom with free market and free enterprise. The Zazu Dreams characters witness social and environmental costs of subjugating others through both fossil fuel-obsessed economies and their ostensible green replacements. Both carbon-intensive extractive industries are rooted in barbaric colonialism and dependent on people and objects reduced to resources as disposable. For example, the green economy has had a devastating impact on California's desert bighorn sheep. 2,500 acres of solar fields, substation, access roads, and other buildings have trampled their migration patterns and habitat. Fallacious renewable energy perpetuates planetary biocide through imperialist lust for technology and insatiable appetite to produce e-junk. As the authors of Deep Green Resistance remind us, the new world of renewables will look exactly like the old in terms of exploitation. Now I go into details. Number one, solar photovoltaic, PVC, and wind technology. Is a community's commitment to ecological living defined by the vastness of their solar arrays or wind turbines? Too often, interrelated infrastructures such as child-rearing, food production, consumption, disposal, transportation, new and existing home energy audits, architecture upgrades, and waste management are ignored, when in fact they should work toward relational energy efficiency, acknowledging Jevons' paradox of efficiency. Given proposed solutions using immense solar and wind harvesting, Western imperialism will continue to dominate global relations. Solar cell, storage production, and global disposal infrastructure, as well as industrial wind farms, use exorbitant resources to produce and implement. Additionally, wind turbines, also known as blenders in the sky, kill migrating wildlife, bats and birds that are critical to functioning ecosystems, and some of whom are endangered species, and all of whom we need to acknowledge in and of themselves, not in an anthropocentric context. As the authors of Bright Green Lies, How the Environmental Movement Lost Its Way, and What We Can Do About It, warn us, quote, industrial civilization requires industrial levels of energy. In reality, solar and wind development threaten to destroy as much land globally as expansion of urban sprawl, oil, and gas, coal, and mining combined by the year 2050, end quote. This is a prime example of replacing one hegemony with another. Wind and solar energies require vast quantities of fossil fuels to execute them on a grand scale. As we have seen throughout California and China, two examples among many, extensive photovoltaic complexes strip land bare, displacing human populations and wildlife migration routes for acres of solar fields, substations, access roads, all of which require incredibly carbon-intensive concrete. 100 to 1,000 times more land is required for wind and solar as for biofuel energy production as well as for biofuel energy production than for fossil fuel production. We need to be extraordinarily conscious of these discrepancies. Number 2, battery technology. According to California's Climate Vulnerability Index, through the Union of Concerned Scientists, fine particulate pollution harms African American communities 43% more than predominantly white communities, Latinx 39% more, and Asian American communities 21% more. As if tailpipe emissions are the only humanitarian catastrophe, one quote-unquote clean solution is the electric vehicle for personal consumption and public transportation. Thoroughly disregarding supply chains and embodied energy, this perceived solution externalizes the costs. Environmental racism is yet again exported out of the United States into the global south, in this case into Bolivia, where lithium, essential for battery production, is primarily mined. It's also mined in the States, for example, at Thacker Pass in Utah, and we are battling that now. The renewable energies movement claims that our global addiction to oil, black gold, should be replaced by lithium, white gold. What is not considered is extracting lithium and converting it to a commercially viable form consumes copious quantities of water, drastically depleting availability for Bolivian indigenous communities and wildlife, and it produces toxic waste, including an already lethal history of chemical leaks. Cobalt, also essential for battery production, is mined in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Like lithium, cobalt's humanitarian and environmental costs are perpetuated by wanton corruption, spurring ecological extermination, child slavery, and death. Additionally, battery e-waste, as well as every link in the solar and wind technology supply chain, is dumped throughout Asia, South America, and Africa. Paul Hawken's phrase, renewable materialism, counsels us that this hyper-idealized shift from a fossil fuel paradigm to renewable energies is an abandonment of empathy and care. An examination of greenwashing as a reflection of neoliberal globalization must coincide with an investigation of divide and conquer propaganda that misdirects individual responsibility, consumer distraction in the face of corporate immunity. Divide and conquer techniques can only be inflicted when individuals do not experience themselves as relational beings, when we operate under the illusion that we are separate from one another and from our natural worlds. Sustainability, then, refers not to sustaining the biocentric integrity of our ecosystems, but rather to sustaining our anthropocentric, energy-addictive lifestyles. In contrast, biocentrism means we do not invest in allegedly renewable energies, colossal infrastructure that supports our current energy consumption. J. Krishnamurti's warning, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society," characterizes both our climate crisis and our potential for collective change as citizen activists. As all forms of climate chaos, climate crises, are interconnected, all forms of climate justice are equally interconnected. Like the metabolism of the human body and the Earth's tendency towards homeostasis, the metabolism of our culture must be scrutinized as a relational organism. When we recognize the patterns of infrastructural and psychic band-aids that perpetuate everyday corporate, consumer-led violence, consumption and entitlement, we can begin to transform our stifling conformity to equality, i.e., dominator civilization standard of living. Through an urgent commitment to creative waste collaborations, we create a bridge between community action, corporate accountability, and policy reform in relation to individual responsibility. The ability to respond, a mutual, deep listening, gleans from indigenous wisdom and biocentric, life-affirming perspectives, biophilic perspectives. Culturally sanctioned empathy emphasizes a respiritualization of nature that embraces community and self-regulatory equilibriums. I contend that the alternative to industrial waste convenience culture is not inconvenience nor sacrifice, and suggest we redefine convenience by following principles found in the natural world, as well as cross-cultural models of mutual accountability and interdependency. This pluriverse nourishes coexistence between humans and non-human nature. This intimacy-based movement is rooted in spiritual practices and everyday life choices. Like Robin Wall Kimmerer's worldview shaped by mutual flourishing, it resonates with the concept of the ecozoic. Eco-theologian Thomas Berry's concept that humans can mutually benefit one another with the worlds around us. Integrating cross-cultural socialist ecofeminism in relation to indigenous environmental philosophies, exemplified by Native women like Winona LaDuke, Dina Gilio-Whitaker, or Quechua human rights activist Monica Chuji, is the ethic underlying the ecozoic era. In conclusion, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't support alternative energies. Although I have never owned a car, my family drives a used electric vehicle, and we utilize secondhand solar panels for our DC fridge. We use no other electricity in our converted school bus tiny home. We use secondhand batteries for our solar energy storage, some of which you can see behind me. We also benefit from a micro-hydroelectric system for our eco-village community's needs. I am suggesting that secondhand, shared, small-scale alternative energy is only the first step to collective resiliency. Usage needs to converge with technological investments that aim to eliminate global environmental hazards and human rights infractions that are currently implicit in the production, storage, and disposal of specious renewable energies. When we talk about practical steps, practicality often implies how the situation can adapt to our needs, rather than how we can shift what we think we need. Reanimating ancient pharmacopoeias, cultural biomimicry, the sacred embodied in bioregional agricultural systems, and environmental agricultural engineering practices that support our life force, rather than simply green architecture, can galvanize people of diverse backgrounds to find allies in unexpected places. I am suggesting that each of us practice environmental justice and creative community action through SOUL. SOUL, shared opportunity used local. When we are clearly attuned with the space and objects around us, SOUL guides us to witness what is already here and how it can be used in surprising coalitional practices. It is imperative that engineers, researchers, and activists incorporate this kind of embodied energy consciousness into their practices. In contrast to sustaining sacrifice zones in which disposable, big quotes obviously, humans, wildlife, and habitat are ravaged and future generations disregarded through venal institutionalized norms, this decommodification practice echoes the ancient spirit of the people of Chile, who, quote, knew how to create rituals where dissonance and difference is not only allowed, but required, end quote. Through debate followed by dialogue, we can bridge seemingly irreconcilable differences and intractable conflicts through active listening and action, collective action. The word ecology derives from the Greek oikos, meaning home, fostering the advantages of working together across cultural, economic, and ethnic differences. We can offer how the concept of home, oikos, economy, ecology, can become a unifying goal, transformative initiatives leading to a biocentric civilization. Through a collective, decentralized commitment to autonomy, cooperation, and reciprocity, a resilient pluriverse of solidarity economics, a kinship commons, Leah Penniman's phrase from Soulfire Farm, represents a balance between individual and communal needs, cultural diversity, and biodiversity. Thank you so much.